Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of Keeping It Capital, where today we're going to be interviewing Luke Cavanaugh, a consultant for the Ukrainian government and the founder of the Interweave Substack. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about digital public infrastructure. Digital public infrastructure, or DPI, is the digital backbone that governments use so their citizens can access money, identity, and services online. Think of it like roads and electricity. You don't own it, but you depend on it for almost everything you do. Every DPI system is built on 3 pillars: digital ID, proving who you are, real time payments, moving your money almost instantly, and data sharing frameworks, letting your information move with you securely and across institutions. Stack those 3 together, and you get a country that runs on a single, interoperable digital layer. Here's the counterintuitive part: the countries leading the race aren't the ones that you'd expect. While the US and Europe are still untangling decades of legacy banking infrastructure, countries in the global south are actually skipping ahead and far into the future. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with our guest, Luke Cavanaugh, where countries in the global south are often way ahead of a curve than even the United States is, especially when it comes to an interoperable, single, unified digital public infrastructure. Let's get into it. Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Keeping It Capital podcast. I'm your host, Ethan, and today we will be covering digital public infrastructure. What is it, where is it, and what does it look like around the world? Today, I am joined by another guest expert here, Luke Cavanaugh. Luke, why don't you give us a second and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ethan. Really great to be on. So I'm Luke Cavanaugh, currently based in Kiev in Ukraine as an advisor to the Ukrainian government with a background in digital government, so across the UK government, and also the founder of Interweave, which is a newsletter and also a convening network for digital government leaders. We host summits for leaders around the world to get together and think about some of the big issues facing the space.
That's super cool. I've always thought Interweave is super interesting, and through a mutual connection of ours, that's how I kind of got introduced to you. Our previous guest on the show, Colin Coulter, rather. Um, he made that initial connection for us. I found your Substack to be super interesting, super engaging, specifically about like what you were trying to create and put out in the world for the audience and as well as the public to kind of take in. So that said, what made you want to start Interweave in the first place? And then what kind of led to that transition to then doing the GovMesh conferences? What were you hope to contribute to the space that you weren't initially seeing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think digital government is obviously quite a new space. I mean,
Hmm.
it's probably now been around, 20, 25 years in some description, but really sort of advanced in the forefront of government agendas over the past 10 to 15 years. What you're
Hmm.
seeing is a lot of governments that are very under pressure from citizens to deliver better and better services. They're used to seeing that in the private sector, but increasingly constrained resource environments and budgets as well. So it's an interesting problem to be working on. It is, in some sense, apolitical, and in other senses, able to deliver huge value to a public. So I think that's what drew me to the space. And I think I was particularly interested by the idea that as it's a new space, you've got lots of countries developing specific niches. So I think we'll talk about a few of them later, but the classic examples are Estonia, are Singapore. But the more I looked into the space, the more you'd see a Moldova or a Bhutan. And I think when I was initially studying digital government during a master's degree, I sort of never saw those stories being told as much. So Interweave was originally set up to tell those different stories around the world, investigate those niches, and that evolved into GovMesh, which brings together those leaders. We sort of talk about it beyond the usual suspects to see what different countries around the world are doing and how they can all learn from each other as well.
And that's one thing that I really hope we get a chance to get into today is it's not often that you see wealthy nations at kind of the forefront of building out digital public infrastructure. It's more so nations in the global south, and really interested to talk about that later on. Now, one thing that I'm curious about, because we really haven't had a chance to cover much on digital public infrastructure on the show so far. So if you could give me like a one sentence definition, that I think that would be super helpful for our audience. If you can't break it down into one sentence, I'll give you a little bit of breathing room. We could do two, but that's it. That's your limit.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess digital public infrastructure or DPI is sort of an approach to building society scale, big, wide digital systems using foundations that are usually boiled down to digital identity, payments, and data
Hmm.
exchange. And if you'll allow me my second sentence, I guess the other thing that's key is the principles behind it. So there's a lot of focus on being open and interoperable. It's a solution to the classic challenge of being sort of locked in to expensive legacy systems.
No, definitely. That's really interesting. One of the things that like when I like to conceptualize it and I try to give like an analogy to folks, I like to think about it as plumbing. And
Yeah.
I know a few folks in the space have referenced it as plumbing as well. And specifically, you really only care about the plumbing until it breaks. So curious to see when when we talk about the plumbing breaking and some of the desires of citizens around the world to have those better services, where do you see those systems breaking most often, and the government's role then to step in to try to alleviate that issue?
Yeah, so again, it's a really good question. I think often the challenge, because it's a challenge both within government and outside of government, is in data exchange. And I think
Hmm.
it's one of the foundational building blocks of DPI. You will often get in a traditional legacy government, the government will ask for a citizen's data, a dozen times across a dozen different departments, and they struggle to really exchange the data between them to offer a more streamlined, more proactive service. And I think if you can get that right as that foundational plumbing, I think one person who talks about this a lot is London's Chief Digital Officer, Theo Blackwell, talking about fixing the plumbing. And he's got an amazing Substack that I'd recommend, and Medium account as well, if people are interested in digital government. But once you've got the data exchange right, that can become a foundation to connect across departments and to change the whole model of how governments and citizens work together. So if you want to file your tax returns, no longer do you have to gather all the disparate bits and pieces, physically go to a registry office. They can actually, the different bits of government that need your data can actually work with each other, send you out a proactive, preemptive tax return that's already filled in, and all you have to do is hit send. And it all starts with the government being able to exchange data itself.
No, definitely. And that's a really interesting distinction that we don't necessarily see here in the States a lot is oftentimes in the United States you see a lot of e-government, not necessarily digital public infrastructure. And when I say e-government, I'm mostly referring to not necessarily like the underpinnings or the plumbing, so to speak, of what's actually going on behind the scenes, but the actual just ability to do a government service online. So for example, the e-government piece in the United States would be like, hey, if you have to renew your driver's license, you could potentially do it online. Now, where the digital public infrastructure piece is, to your point, being able to accept and process that data and exchange that data throughout the various different government services that would then need it. But e-government, in my understanding, is kind of like that cover that you see is more of the consumer-facing angle versus the actual back-end stuff, and that's more digital public infrastructure. Want to dive into one of the references that you talked about when we're talking about data exchange. You did a recent Substack article on Nepal and how they recently created a digital identity service. And with that, one of the issues that they're currently facing in that country is the lack of the data exchanges themselves. So I was curious if you could, explain that topic a little bit further for us and shed some light on some of the problems that they've been experiencing there.
Yeah, so I guess maybe to generalize it out slightly, I think that
Sure.
Nepal is a really good example, but I think that they're certainly not the only example. I think when you to come back to your previous point, when you don't have the sort of data exchange in place and you're
Hmm.
trying to do other things, there is a danger of falling back into the same old patterns of
Right.
digitally recreating an analog service, like you say. And I think there's an increasingly a push in the space, both from the sort of more visionary digital leaders, so your likes of Singapore
Hmm.
or any of the Baltics, to say, well, when we're going forward, why don't we transform those services entirely? So you're used to the government treating education like apps, but with better data, they can treat it like why. And I
Hmm.
think a really good example of this, and maybe what a country like Nepal might aspire to, is sort of life event services. And for those listeners who haven't come across these before, it basically breaks down a citizen's life into a sort of user journey, as it were, from sort of birth till death. And, as you maybe turn 18, become an adult, there are a whole range of services that suddenly become accessible to you or that the government requires from you. And if you start to think about that, and rather than thinking of departments in silos, thinking as someone gets married, what does all the government need to do? Then I think data exchange becomes A, the key to unlocking those proactive services, and B, like a huge way to provide values to citizens. And maybe I'll just give a really brief example that's often talked about in the UK, which is the Tell Us Once service. And what that is that if a loved one or a partner dies, and you tell a government department that that has happened, they are then responsible for that data exchange across government. So what it means that, like, if you tell the Department for Work and Pensions, for example, they will tell the tax services, who will then not be, when you're trying to grieve in the loss of a loved one, the last thing you want is the tax service reaching out to say, hey, X or
Right.
Y haven't paid their taxes this year. So in Nepal, anywhere else, it's sort of all underpinned by that data exchange.
No, definitely. Yeah, it would be really, really neat if we had a service like that in the States. I'm sure that would definitely be, helpful for folks, in the bereavement process and the grieving process. Um, Now, I'm curious if we could talk more about the concept of like these less wealthy nations, whether it's in the Baltic regions or in the Himalayan region, potentially having um, more expertise and being more forward in these spaces. Why does that happen? One would think, with all the resources that we have in the United States or in the United Kingdom as well, that you all or we would be at the forefront of that. But in reality, the people that are making, like blockchain, on-chain citizenships are these folks in these lesser developed nations in the global South.
Yeah, so I think you pick up on a really good point that digital public infrastructure is a space where the global south has been leading for quite a while. And I think that
Hmm.
the classic example of this is India. And India were one of the first countries to really crack the DPI thing
Hmm.
with, for example, Aadhaar, which is their digital identity system. And what they did is that rather than commissioning one vendor to provide a bespoke digital ID solution, the unique identification authority of India, what they did is they created an open identity system, which then other providers could plug into. And this really sort of became a big deal when they had the G20 presidency a few years ago, and they sort of began to talk about this. Brazil did something very similar. And this speaks exactly to your point of sort of global South leadership. To your question as why that is, I think there's a number of factors. I think one is the idea of just cost. So there's a great paper that came out about DPI from Chatham House, a UK based think tank, about a month ago. And they made the point that government spend in OECD countries is 20 on IT is 20 times that of non-OECD countries, which means that they can often afford a bespoke gold-plated digital ID system. It also leaves them vulnerable to having to there's a technological advancement they have to build from scratch, or they get locked into a vendor, or as Europe is finding out right now, in a case of sovereignty, it is difficult to be sovereign if you tied yourself to one player. So I think there's a point of cost. There is also a idea of tech dependency, and there's also a desire to create national champions. And
No,
one of the people, sorry, no, go on.
no, 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 you first. I was really interested in that sovereignty piece but go on.
Yeah, I mean, just one more point I was going to make. I mean, the probably world leader on this is a guy called David Eves, who we interviewed at Interweave a couple of years ago, and he's based at the UCL in London, University College London. And when I was talking to him, he was talking about, potential motivations you might have for developing DPI. And he sort of boils it down to three things: economic development, a regulatory impetus, or the protection of sovereignty.
Hmm.
And if you think about a country like the US, let's imagine that like the primary reason could be a regulatory one why you build DPI.
Sure.
But for India, it's like very clearly an economic development piece.
Hmm.
And I think that's super interesting because it puts the momentum and the emphasis of why we develop DPI in a very different place. And if they're the ones who are setting the tone, it just means that like the space will evolve in a very different direction. And when I talked to him, he was like, well, if that is the case in DPI, like what might that look like in climate tech? If it ends up being the global south who does something like that. So
Sure.
it's a really interesting precursor to watch across other places as well.
Yeah, and what that makes me think of off the top of my head is the United States doesn't necessarily need that context, number one, for economic development, but certainly not for sovereignty either. Really quick for the audience, could you help define, what is sovereignty broadly speaking, just so they have like that foundational understanding of like, okay, like, yes, like it's a country's right to exist essentially, like there's statehood, not necessarily a concept that we've defined on the show. Just because the majority of our content is more payments, more credit, more cryptocurrency focus. But I think that would be helpful as it leads into our next topic as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess I'm thinking about sovereignty here from a very specific digital perspective. And I guess
Hmm.
digital sovereignty is about sort of being able to be self-sufficient or to be
Hmm.
able to control, in particular, data
Right.
within an ecosystem. A lot of conversation at the moment in Europe about having European-wide sovereignty. There is a bit of a panic around a sort of Eurostat. What it certainly doesn't mean is sort of isolating oneself, but it
Hmm.
does mean controlling an entire tech stack, or at least being like very clear on where there's in Europe we talk about controlling, steering, and depending. So where you control and where you're happy to depend on others as well.
That's very interesting. Curious, what are, the folks in the EU tending to lean on for other parties to be able to control in their tech stack versus which ones, do they necessarily want to keep under control for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on the sort of sovereignty piece. I would say
Sure.
it's like it is very different in different countries. I think um, you know, different people are taking different stances on it. For example, you have sort of a lot of collaboration in Western Europe between different countries right now. So France, for example, has just made their own version of Microsoft Teams called Visio, which they're rolling out across government. Belgium have just developed their own sovereign communications platform. There is like a lot of money, there is like a lot of emphasis. In other places, there is either sort of less concern about sovereignty, or there is sort of less money, less resources. And I think within that, you've also got the question of like, does a country build on their own or do they use an open source solution? And I think
Sure.
increasingly countries are just trying to open source, different applications. But I mean, when we think about sovereignty, you can think about it at the application level, but to your point, and going back to our conversation of the whole stack, that
Hmm.
could be anything from making sure you have a reliable supply of energy to build your data centers,
No,
to making
definitely.
sure you have compute power. So
Hmm.
it's a sort of very multifaceted question depending on where you take it.
No, definitely. And while we're on the topic of sovereignty, I was curious if we could dive into a little bit about Bhutan specifically, and their self-sovereign identity program. That is something that we've really been interested here on the channel. It's another use case for blockchain. And for those that aren't familiar with blockchain, or this is your first time tuning in to Keeping It Capital, blockchain is a distributed ledger network. So it effectively allows you to input across different nodes, the various communications and transactions into an immutable ledger. Basically, what that means in plain English is all that really has to do with being able to have a direct, unchangeable ledger of events and or transactions. And now how they're using it in Bhutan is really interesting. They are on Ethereum's network, but specifically what they're doing it is with citizenship. So, Luke, I was hoping you could fill us in on what that looks like specifically and what that looks like in practice, because that's how we're kind of building that excuse me, that's how we're building that building block from, what we traditionally talk about here on the channel, which is cryptocurrency and payments, to why we're bringing it to digital public infrastructure.
Yeah, for sure. So Bhutan is a really interesting example, one of my favorite examples in the space. So I guess context for those listeners less familiar, small country in South Asia, and it is one of the most, I think, in terms of the population density, one of the least dense in the world, hugely rural population,
Hmm.
very mountainous country as well, so like quite hard to traverse. So I think a lot of the problems of traditional paper government having to go to offices and that sort of thing are especially exacerbated there. And a few years ago, Bhutan caught global headlines when their crown prince, so sort of 7 years old at the time, became
Right.
their first digital citizen.
Sure.
Um, and so essentially, they came up with this idea of having digital ID in the country to reduce all the administrative burden placed on both government officials and the citizens that had to interact with them. And at first, they looked to the world leaders in the space, to Estonia and Singapore, whose identity or digital ID systems depend on having a centralized public register
Hmm.
or a central authority whose job it is to sort of automatically or otherwise prove identity. And this is like quite an expensive solution and quite hard to scale. So instead, what they did, as you mentioned, is they became the first country to choose a self sovereign digital ID model. So what that means is that the digital ID is placed in the hands of individual citizens, and you have, as you mentioned, your decentralized identifiers on the blockchain. And so if you imagine, I'm trying to think of a good example. So imagine you're going to a bar, though this is
Which,
probably not the best use of a digital ID. So the government sort of gives you your ID, and there's a verifiable credential that says you're over 18, and that's
right.
sort of issued from the government. Then the holder, who is the Bhutanese citizen, goes to the bar, and then the person on the door asks them, to prove that ID. And they can then control what they share and with who. So they'll just have a sort of digital wallet. They will have their signature or proof they're a citizen and proof
Hmm.
of their age. So they can share their age in a way that the bar would know was issued by the government without sharing, for example, their name, the place they were born, the mother's maiden name,
Right.
whatever data the government might have on you. And I think there is a broader, and this is beyond the scope of my knowledge. There is a really broad, interesting situation going on at the moment with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in Bhutan more generally. They have a lot
Hmm.
of excess hydropower that they're using for Bitcoin mining. I think they're like sixth or seventh in the world in
Oh,
terms
wow.
of Bitcoin mining. It's become really interesting in terms of their broader national strategy, but in terms of the self-sovereign digital ID, that is where they're at.
No, that's incredibly cool. I had no idea that there was something that, huh, yeah, that's pretty neat. Yeah, one of the things that I'm, currently thinking through as I, process that is, where, what is that, you know, is there room on the bone essentially like to carve out for other countries potentially that do have excess hydroelectric power as a form of government revenue is being able to have or utilize blockchain for government revenue. But I guess that's neither here nor there, not necessarily on the topic of the podcast. Maybe that's something we explore in a future episode. Um, but now we're starting to get towards the end of our time together. So, Luke, I really appreciate you having you on. Wanted to talk more about you and kind of Interweave and GovMesh. Could you explain, like, what GovMesh is? I'm familiar with it as kind of like a closed door peer-to-peer conference of digital government leaders. But like, why did you want to bring that specifically into the world? And how did you, begin to get those leaders to have conversations together?
Yeah, so GovMesh is something that started about a year and a half ago, and Interweave do it with great partners. So we have GovInsider, that are a Singaporean-based media outlet, and also generously supported by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation in Singapore as well. And we sort of decided, to go back to our earlier conversation, there was a lot of countries that we thought were doing amazing things and maybe didn't have the means or the sort of fora to communicate and work with each other. You think it's very easy for alliances in new spaces, or maybe not even alliances, probably too strong a word, just gatherings in new spaces to look back to old ones. So you'd have the sort of same traditional economic powers working together, or maybe people in geographic similarities to
Hmm.
each other. So we sort of set up that space as a closed door format for these government leaders to speak in a very honest and candid way with each other about both like the successes and what they're doing right now, but also looking ahead to the future and some of the challenges as well. So far we've held four GovMesh summits. We've held two in Singapore, one in Lithuania, and one in Germany. And we'll have a couple coming up a little bit later on this year. And I think the aim right now is to take these from a series of discrete summits and turn that into a real community of practice for these leaders to sort of continue to learn from each other as well as they sort of go in and build what we see as very like the frontier of the digital government space.
No, definitely. And I really, it's really amazing that, one individual, and I know you work with a team over on Interweave, but that you guys are able to, bring those experts together. I feel like you're doing, those countries a great service, and as well as, some of the regional partners, and just being able to have folks in a room to have those conversations, that's something that, we probably wish in the States we would be able to have, at least even from a bipartisan perspective, to get folks, talking to one another. So, I don't think it's fair for me to thank you on behalf of those governments, but it's really cool that you're able to put that together. So one last question for you today before we sign off here. Where can people find interweave.gov and GovMesh, and what is the best way to follow you and get involved in your work and track some of the awesome things that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think definitely check out our Substack. That's probably the best place, interweave.gov on Substack. But we have a LinkedIn, we have a website as well. And I think, as you mentioned, a really awesome team working at Interweave. I mean, Yogesh is sort of who also from the team works on GovMesh. And I think also check out some of our partners as well. So I already mentioned GovInsider, I mentioned KAS, but we've worked a lot with GovTech Lab in Lithuania, who are in the government doing amazing things, co-hosted with us in Vilnius. And I think hopefully through there, you'll sort of get a bit more of a sense of the broader ecosystem too.
Definitely. Well, Luke, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you having it, coming on the show and sharing your expertise. I know I learned a ton on our episode today. So for the folks in the audience, thank you so much for tuning into Keeping It Capital. We always appreciate your viewership. Check out our Substack. This episode will be on Spotify, on YouTube, and also check out our LinkedIn. More content to come, folks. Thank you guys so much.